Why some men feel impossible to replace. There's a reason some men disappear from a woman's mind almost immediately, while others stay there for years. And it usually has nothing to do with looks, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with status. Because if attraction worked, that simply, people would be easy to replace emotionally. But they're not. Some people leave a psychological imprint that stays long after the relationship, the conversations, or even the connection itself ends. And most men never understand why. They think being unforgettable is about doing more. More attention, more effort, more reassurance, more availability. But the truth is usually the opposite. What makes a man feel impossible to replace is rarely what he gives. It's how different he feels emotionally compared to everyone else. Most people today are emotionally predictable. They react quickly. They seek validation constantly. They become emotionally attached too fast. They panic when distance appears. They over-explain themselves. They chase reassurance. And because these behaviors are common, they stop feeling emotionally significant. Nothing stands out. Everything blends together. And people rarely remember what feels emotionally ordinary. But then there are certain men who feel different immediately. Not louder, not more emotional, not more performative, just different. Their energy feels calmer, more grounded, less approval-seeking. They do not emotionally collapse the moment uncertainty appears. And that emotional stability creates something rare in modern relationships. Emotional contrast. Because most people are used to emotional inconsistency. They're used to emotional pressure, used to anxiety, used to emotional dependency. So when someone enters their life with calmness, emotional control, and quiet confidence, it immediately changes the emotional experience. And emotional experiences are what the brain remembers most. A lot of men think attraction is built through constant effort. But emotional impact is not created through quantity. It is created through emotional depth. And depth often comes from restraint, from emotional control, from not reacting impulsively every time emotions shift. This is one reason emotionally grounded men feel difficult to replace, because their emotional presence feels rare. And rare experiences create stronger memory. The brain naturally holds on to what feels uncommon, not what feels repeated. Another reason some men feel impossible to replace is because they never make their entire emotional identity revolve around being chosen. This is important. Many men slowly lose their emotional center inside relationships. Their mood depends on our responses. Their confidence depends on our attention. Their emotional stability depends on constant reassurance. And over time, this creates emotional heaviness. Because dependency changes energy. But a man who maintains his direction, his standards, and his emotional stability, even while caring deeply, creates a completely different emotional effect. Now his presence feels intentional instead of needy. His attention feels valuable instead of automatic. And value changes perception. This is why some women only fully realize a man's emotional impact after distance appears. Because emotional familiarity can hide emotional value. When someone is constantly available, the brain adapts to their presence. It stops consciously noticing the emotional effect they have. But once space appears, awareness returns. Now, the contrast becomes visible. Now she notices what felt different about him emotionally. Not because he manipulated anything, but because emotional absence creates emotional reevaluation. And this is where many men make a massive mistake. The moment they feel emotional distance, they panic. They try to force reconnection immediately. More texting, more explanations, more emotional reactions. But desperation destroys emotional rarity very quickly, because emotional control disappears. And once emotional control disappears, attraction often changes with it. What makes certain men unforgettable is not emotional coldness. It is emotional steadiness. There's a difference. Coldness pushes people away emotionally. Steadiness creates emotional safety without emotional dependency. And that combination is powerful, very powerful, because most people rarely experience it. Some men create attraction through excitement. Others create attraction through validation. But the men who feel impossible to replace usually create attraction through emotional presence. The feeling that their energy affects the entire emotional atmosphere around them. Calmness, confidence, self-respect, patience, emotional discipline. These traits affect people psychologically far more than most realize. Women especially pay attention to emotional reactions. Not just words, not just effort. Reactions. How a man handles uncertainty. How he handles distance. How he handles pressure. How he handles silence. And these moments quietly shape emotional perception over time. Because emotionally reactive men often feel emotionally common. But emotionally centered men feel emotionally rare. And rarity creates emotional memory. Another reason some men feel impossible to replace is because they never fully become emotionally predictable. Not because they play games, but because they maintain individuality. Their life does not revolve entirely around the relationship. They have goals, focus, standards, direction, and this creates psychological space. Space keeps attraction mentally active because the mind continues observing what it has not fully categorized yet. People often think deep attraction is built through constant emotional exposure. But sometimes too much exposure weakens emotional intensity. Everything becomes familiar, expected, processed, and processed emotions rarely feel exciting psychologically. This is why emotional independence matters so much. A man who can care deeply without emotionally losing himself feels different, because his emotional state does not constantly beg for reassurance. And that emotional self-control changes how people experience his presence. At the deepest level, people become impossible to replace when they create an emotional experience that feels difficult to find elsewhere. Not perfection, not performance, difference, emotional difference, because the brain does not strongly remember what feels common. It remembers what feels rare, what feels emotionally distinct, what creates contrast, what changes emotional state. And that is why some women think about certain men years later. Not because those men were perfect, not because they tried the hardest, but because something about their emotional presence felt uncommon enough to leave a lasting imprint. And emotional imprints are difficult to replace. Very difficult. At the end of the day, becoming unforgettable is not really about being perfect. It's not about always saying the right thing, not about always being available, not about constantly proving your value through effort, attention, or reassurance. Because people eventually adapt to effort. They adapt to attention. They adapt to constant emotional availability. And once something becomes emotionally expected, the emotional intensity around it slowly decreases. This is why many men slowly become emotionally invisible without realizing it. Not because they lack value, but because their emotional presence becomes too familiar, too readable, and too dependent on constant validation. What actually makes someone difficult to replace is emotional distinction. The feeling that being around this person created an emotional experience that feels uncommon compared to most people. And uncommon emotional experiences stay in memory longer because the brain is constantly searching for emotional patterns that stand out from normal experience. When something feels emotionally rare, the mind gives it more psychological weight, more attention, more reflection, more emotional replay. This is why emotionally grounded men often leave stronger long-term impressions than emotionally reactive men. Because emotional steadiness is rare now. Very rare. Most people today are emotionally impulsive. Their emotions shift constantly based on attention, validation, or uncertainty. So when someone remains calm under pressure, when someone maintains self-respect during emotional shifts, when someone does not emotionally collapse the moment things become uncertain, it creates a completely different emotional effect. And people feel that difference immediately, even if they cannot explain it logically. A woman may not consciously say, "This man feels emotionally rare," but emotionally she experiences it. She feels the difference in his reactions, his patience, his calmness, his emotional control, his ability to remain centered, especially during moments where most people become emotionally reactive. And those moments matter more than most men realize, because attraction is often shaped less by words and more by emotional experience over time. This is also why some men become unforgettable after distance appears, because once constant interaction disappears, all that remains is emotional impact. No distractions, no daily attention, just the emotional memory of how that person felt. And if that emotional feeling was strong, calm, grounded, or psychologically distinct, the brain keeps revisiting it, sometimes for years. The truth is, people rarely miss what was emotionally ordinary. They miss what felt emotionally different, what felt difficult to replace, what affected their emotional state in a way they don't experience often. An emotional rarity is far more powerful than most men understand, because rarity creates value psychologically, not forced value, perceived value. This is why trying too hard often works against attraction. The more a man tries to force significance, the more emotionally common he often becomes, because chasing, over-explaining, emotional overinvestment, and desperation are behaviors people see constantly. They're emotionally familiar, and familiarity rarely creates deep emotional imprint. But calm confidence, emotional self-control, quiet self-respect, those things feel uncommon now. And uncommon emotional experiences naturally create stronger memory. Not because they are loud, but because they are rare. At the deepest level, people become impossible to replace when their emotional presence changes how someone feels internally in a way that cannot easily be recreated elsewhere. That is the real reason some men stay in a woman's mind long after the relationship ends. Not because they were perfect, not because they tried harder than everyone else, but because something about their energy, emotional steadiness, and presence felt psychologically distinct from what most people experience every day. And once the mind experiences something emotionally distinct, it becomes very difficult to fully forget it, because emotional memory is not based on logic. It is based on impact, and impact is what lasts. Follow for more if you want to understand women better.